Welcome to Reddit Steady Go. Tonight, we dive into another story you won't easily forget. Turn off the lights, put on your headphones, and remember, everything you're about to hear was posted online as true.
This is a story about flying saucers. I say, flying saucers, because it lends an air of the innocent and childlike, even the everyday, to something that became, in those heavy days of the mid-1990s, so absorbed in currents of recursive conspiracies, with gruesome accounts of surgically dismembered cows, pierced abdomens, and abductions, that it was almost a branch of psychological horror. One day someone should study how the visceral ufology of that time did or did not reflect the time itself, before it all collapsed in an orgy of butchers' throwaways in a cheap London bedsit, thanks to Ray Santilli and his Roswell autopsy footage. I often wonder, now that we seem so certain there is nothing out there at all, what the significance of alien implants and painful experiments and UFO crashes with the all-important dead bodies and child-sized coffins really was. No, this is an old-fashioned story about lights and discs in the sky. When I was 8, I had my first encounter with strange things in the heavens. It was in a book that I treasured for its full-color drawings and paintings, more vivid to a child with slightly dodgy eyes than real photos, which are often, of course, fuzzy and out of focus, if they depict anything other than a blurry cloud, that is. Reading that book, day after day, I was gripped by a certainty I can remember as clearly as if it were in my diary for tomorrow, a bone-shaking knowledge, or insight, that something truly strange was happening, not here, maybe, in the shallow valleys of England, apart from everyone losing their jobs, but somewhere else, everywhere else. It would take an effort not to see a UFO, because they would be lurking, especially in slate-gray autumnal skies, and, crucially, whenever I opened my curtains at night. There they would be, turning at right angles, shimmering and glowing, and I would have no more ordinary world to fall back on. In fact, this is exactly how it did happen, though it was 8 years later and the world had moved on from delicious glimpses by then, into the full-blooded murderousness of the great epidemic I mentioned before. And something even weirder happened on the same day. Despite my conviction by then that Truman's signature on the MJ-12 documents was real, that JFK had been telling Marilyn Monroe of the vast conspiracies, and that live aliens were being stored and occasionally interrogated in U.S. bases, I did have a few friends. One of them, Paul, was my best friend, though I was not his, and I suspect that I felt like this because he was everything I am still not, tall, fabulously intelligent, and good with women. Paul and I would talk, he would teach me about fields of learning I had barely even heard of, and I would listen to this thinking savior and see if I could remember any of it the next day. I depended on Paul entirely for my sense of intelligence. We took the same bus home every day, and by tradition we walked some of the way together before he wandered off to a little cut-through that took him to his brand new estate on the eastern edge of the village. One day in October of our exam year, I watched him turn to walk, as elegantly as ever, down the road to the little cut-through. He stopped and waved, which was unusual, and he just faded out of sight, his bag dropping to the ground, hitting the concrete before his outline had disappeared. I stood, almost unconscious, before running towards where he had been, feeling just blank, and like I had, literally, lost my mind, or that it had vanished. It must have taken me 5 or 6 seconds to get there, I know that because I've done it several times since. There had been nowhere to go but wall and garden, not enough time for him to reach the end of the cut-through, and I would have seen him climbing or squeezing into someone's garden. When I had regained some semblance of thought, if not sanity, I walked towards his house with that very childish combination of utter foolishness and total urgency, down the cut-through, staring at the fences that ran down the length of it, looking for a clue, a hand, a giggle, something, however out of this sensitive and almost humorless character it would have been. I knew that I would have seen him. I would have seen him. I hung around his house for a few hours, calling and waiting, waiting and calling, until I realized that I was making his parents more anxious, and I wondered what my own mother would be thinking. It was then about 9 and dark and cold. So I went home, taking Paul's bag with me. It was still lying there as I walked back from his parents' house. I sat alone with the bag until deep into the night, when it suddenly began to feel heavy, as though someone had dropped something into it. Startled by the sensation, I opened it for the first time. Inside was the usual detritus of a teenage boy's school rucksack, crumpled up letters, notes, and sheets, creased books with torn-off corners lying in the crevices of the fabric, leaking pens. And something else as well, that looked like a stone, except that its gray surface was translucent, no, opaque. I could see the blur of my hand as I held up the palm-sized object to the stark light. I remember thinking I must have accidentally pressed too hard as I held it, for then it made a kind of whistling noise and disappeared. Like a light going out. Time is a kind of uninhibitor, an alcohol for the soul. I could say that I was astonished, bewildered, frozen with fear, wear out my thesaurus trying to describe it, but the fact is, I did not feel anything at all. Sometime later that night, the phone rang. Not for long enough to know if it was real, but I heard 2 or 3 of the lacerating stabbing noises slicing through my sleep. I sat up and thought of going to the phone but decided against it. I looked out of my window instead. I suppose it was 2 or 3 o'clock because the night felt deep, the darkness permanent. And there they were, 3, no 4, darting and shooting lights, silver-hued pinpoints of light turning and racing in the sky. They seemed to form quick fading patterns, geometrical, I thought. Before I had time to try and work out how long this had been happening, it stopped, the points of lights disappeared. The next morning I went to the police with Paul's bag. He had not reappeared and it seemed fairly clear to me that he would not. They did investigate for a while but soon seemed to lose interest. In fact, I remember the day that happened well. It was 2 months later, nearly Christmas, when the duty officer at the local station, who I'd been bugging for weeks, said to me, without even looking at me, "Lots of young lads disappear, son, they go off to London or somewhere exciting. It's not really our business." He didn't even appear to have the file or know the name. I wandered home in such a depression that I just went straight to bed, ignoring my mother's pleas to at least have some soup. Night had long since cloaked the valley and I was left staring out of the window, watching the slow, inevitable turn of the night sky. I did wonder whether what I had seen that night of Paul's disappearance was real, but not for long, and I could not summon enough awe, fear, anxiety, call it what you like, to really bother. The solid move of the moon and stars was enough. Suddenly one of the stars in Orion's belt headed away, towards the low moon, turning like a sharp wave as it did so. I sat up. Then another star did the same, then more, until there were about 8 pinpricks of light flashing across the sky like rogue cursors on a dull computer game. In and out they weaved. No, they didn't. In the main they kept straight lines, tracing only the most angular patterns across the night. I paused to think, for though would surely make it real, rational thought, calculations, now was I afraid. What was I feeling? Again the encroach of blankness and silence in my mind. This time something intruded, the profound sense that this was a display. At that moment it stopped and all was explicable again. My clock said 2:30 a.m. but I remember thinking that I had been awake all evening and it had not been 8 hours since I had plunged myself into bed. The following day, plagued by a growing sense of unreality, I snuck into the school computer room and tried to use the embryonic World Wide Web to see if anyone else had seen anything. Nothing. Over the next few days I realized I could find no one, in the village, school, or world, it seemed, who had shared my experience. Eventually this quest to prove I had not been dreaming, it now transpired had to be abandoned when revision and then later exams started looming. By that time I had read a great deal of what I outlined at the start of this story. The dark, even evil undertones of contemporary UFO lore always made me shudder, whereas my weird, real, experiences raised nothing in me except my growing feeling of dislocation. There was also the question of sex. Flying saucers and animal mutilation, not to mention spontaneous vanishings, were no way to obtain this precious gem of adolescence. So by the time my exams started in earnest I had learned to let it all rest in the back of my mind. Besides, as I prepared to sit the exams that would hopefully set me on the path of a proper life, I hardly knew whether I had experienced anything at all, or whether I had come to convince myself that I had out of a way of dealing with stress. Gradually it seemed the most likely explanation. But Paul, that I had seen it, I had held his bag. After the final exam that June, I decided to go and see his parents. I'd kept out of their way out of a feeling that I had no right. I was much closer to him than he had been to me. But now, remembering our plan to communicate in every exam, whether by obscene gesture or synchronized cough, I thought it would be good to say hello and register my best wishes. Paul's estate was one I knew well, having lived there myself as a child. I took the cut through to the reconstituted stone semi-detached houses and their neat little front gardens, noticing as I emerged into the quiet, narrow street, a small play area with 3 children playing football that I did not remember. As I approached Paul's house, the sense grew that this play area was my focus. I could not raise my eyes from it, even though I was looking for the distinctive eyebrow-like stone gables of his house. Then I stopped and my legs would go no further. This was it. This was his house. I looked all around to see if I had dozily walked onto the wrong street, but no, this was it. There was no house. The play area was his house. I asked the children how long it had been like this, but they just shrugged as small children do. They did not understand because it had never been any different. I went home numbly and asked my mother, but she answered only vaguely, as she was reading the paper, I supposed. But then, I recalled, no one had spoken of Paul for months. I had not even asked anyone for months, not even while I was looking up alien abduction in the school library and reading battered copies of Timothy Good books. I was left in a sort of hypnagogic state, where images fly by without a murmur and bizarrity slips even into the grammar of thought. Was I suffering a breakdown? Was I telling myself a story, even to reassure myself that I had purpose in the world? I went out for a walk. I had got into the habit of this, though it fed my fantasies and solved nothing. I rounded the corner of our road, heading towards the center of the village, when I saw the flying disc. At exactly the moment I could feel myself slipping away into this hole of strangeness. There it was, unmistakable, solid and steady, behind and beyond houses in the early summer drizzle. It glided, silently, though I could feel a low hum from somewhere, and it was a dull wet tarmac grayish-black, featureless but a classic disc shape. It seemed to spin as it traveled over the rooftops. I looked around, tried to shout, "Look, look!" But there were few people around in the grim wet street, and those who were, walked rapidly through the puddles, heads bowed. No one responded to my shouts, or seemed to notice anything at all. It ambled out of sight, towards the southern edge of the valley, out of the village. I watched it go, which it did with a kind of lopsided grace. I stood for a while, then I had a feeling that if I went back to Paul Street everything would have righted itself and I'd see his house. But the little play area was still there, the house still never having had existed. Paul had been lifted out of existence completely. He really had never been at all. There I left him, which was the right place for him, and the flying saucers and everything else that was not completely explicable, and I managed to build myself a life. After September 11th, the final interest seemed to be sucked out of the whole UFO subject, and it has never really captured the public imagination again since. Nor have I seen anything in the skies since except planes. The strangest things I ever saw after that were B-52s leaving RAF Fairford for Iraq. But a couple of years ago, Paul's bag turned up on my doorstep with the morning milk. At least I found them together. The bag was exactly how I remembered it, though a little cleaner and new-looking, the books inside less torn. The stone was there too. The sight of the bag filled me, not with fear, but with a ferocious desire to recapture the weirdnesses of my youth, for the return of whatever delusions I had been suffering. Of Paul I accepted even then, as I held his bag on that frosty November morning, that he would not return, that he really never had existed at all. This was still his bag. I looked up and down the street, half expecting to see a flying disc, but there was nothing except the pale, withdrawing ink of a lightning sky. At the end of the road, though, was a tall figure which stopped and waved before heading out of sight. It was not him. Delusion and illusion are the same, and there is nothing. There was nothing, I should say. The figure had merely stopped to ruffle its hair, or even to wave at someone else. It was a kind of thrill at that moment, to know that I would once more understand nothing, that sense would again desert me, a world without boundaries. I looked down into the bag again and checked for Paul's name inside the textbooks. I felt as I did so the absence of that stone, and saw that the name in all the books was mine, as I had known all along.
What? Oh yeah, ghoul friends, that is going to wrap it up for tonight's episode. Thanks a ton for hanging out with me and letting me gnaw your ear for a bit. If you had a good time, do me a solid, smash that subscribe button, ring the little bell, and you'll never miss another creepy conversation.